The Worldview of Paul Cezanne by Jane Roberts. And this is chapter 10. And Jane was asked by her husband Rob for a book on Paul Cezanne. And Jane, being a trance medium, or trance channeler rather, went into herself deeply and connected with Paul Cezanne and channeled this information in this book. And this chapter is on the origins of painting. And this is what Paul Cezanne had to say. This is entry number 23 from March 30th, 1976, 11:10 a.m. till noon. So 50 minutes of channeling. I consider painting to be a natural language that leaps the boundaries of race and nationality in a way that the written word or spoken language cannot. For by its nature, painting deals with the given elements of the natural world in a more direct manner. That is, the language of painting allows for no symbols to stand between the communicator and the perceiver. If such symbols are used, they are still based firmly on the visual processes, so that any variations from a given object are obvious. Visual symbolism is used, which can be followed by any person with eyes. No other translation is necessary. For that matter, the painting can clearly convey emotional feelings and impacts without ever mentioning them specifically. In that regard, the objects of the natural world, visually stated, can also be used as symbols that work for the perceiver, whether or not he has an education, for example. The painting of a tree is a clear visual statement that can be recognized by anyone, child or adult, lettered or unlettered, foreigner or native. Beyond this, the artist imparts those intangibles of emotional content that become attached to the painting itself and appeal in a direct manner to the sensibilities of the viewer. By varying in degree to which he faithfully tries to duplicate the object, sometimes rendering it as close to nature as possible, and sometimes using the object only as a reference point, the artist has great leeway in the statements he makes, ranging from the concrete to the abstract. In so doing, he sets up kind of a perspective that cannot be stated by the use of the written word, because the painted designs themselves are visual representations for what they stand for. For example, the words near and far may be close to each other in a sentence, though their meaning suggests that a distance should be between them. In a painting, however, using this analogy, the visual elements corresponding to those words would be separate visually, the idea of time depicted through further gradations, through the use of lighter and darker tones for near and far that would further depict the differences between them. To perform the same kind of service in writing, the words near and far would have to be written in such a way that near was in larger letters, perhaps brightly colored, while far would be written in a lighter hand, with smaller letters grayly colored, and the words further separated, so that they appeared at distant ends of the sentence. Of course, the reader would also have to know that to read the language in which the sentence was written. However, let me read that sentence again. Of course, the reader would also have to know how to read the language in which the sentence was written. Words, however, in any language seldom look like the objects that they represent, so no real visual clues exist. Children are taught to read with the use of pictures. They must be taught what pictures or combinations of letters stand for a given object. I am convinced that man used drawing as a language for eons, graduating to sign language, in which the letters still have some visual connection with the objects they represented. The spoken languages and alphabets then appeared, But pictures were behind the alphabets. The early sign languages were most likely the result of man's attempt to make objects small, manageable, so that they could be carried, each one standing for an object. These were then arranged according to the individual's intent. Further sophistications followed because the signs became too bulky, until one sign stood for several meanings. Perhaps there were other stages in between. For example, in some dim past, man might actually have carried his language around with him in the form of lightweight miniature wood carvings, each representing visual replicas of common objects, such as a sentence of objects, most likely read in a certain sequence. I should imagine that the carving nearest the viewer would represent the present demand for a like object, and that the motion back and forth of the carvings would represent the communication between the speaker and the listener. Perhaps this was the beginning of certain games, and the motion of the physical objects may have facilitated the first use of verbal language, as man followed unconsciously those principles now used by educators in teaching children to read. Miniature wood carvings would be too bulky, ultimately, of course, for even the lightest and smallest would require the individual to carry them about and hamper the use of hands for other purposes. Certainly, such tiny replicas of objects were behind the papyrus writing. However, in areas where very lightweight yet durable materials were available, these carvings were probably made instead of papyrus or even of leaves, perhaps held together with light mud. I should imagine that finally tribes had their own stationary carvings, made of any of the mentioned ingredients, kept in some central place, so that any member of the tribe could use them to communicate with another member. Certainly they could be used as a way for the head of the tribe to speak being in quotes, to the entire tribe at once in a central place. It would be later, to my way of thinking, that these miniature carvings, having the same shape as the objects they represented, were then further symbolized, the shapes being drawn on a wall or larger protected surface and being rendered visually alone. The man's literal nature suggests the existence of the initial stage of modeling. Molding or carving the miniature replicas of objects first, however, and the arrangement of these in certain fashions before the symbolic drawing of the representations. Further refinements at that point would have become necessary, and these suggest the greater sophistication in a way that man handled his mental world. For example, the miniature model of a tree shape, whether in bark, paper, or leaf, had a separate quality and mocked the original in a particular fashion. Though this mock tree did not grow or die, it was recognizable, and a man could pick it up as he would, say, a twig. Perhaps, for that matter, natural objects themselves were used in the beginning when this was possible. It would not be practical in many cases, however, because there are too many natural objects not portable enough for the purpose. In any case, the model was a decent representation of the original. When the model was drawn, however, it lost its object nature. Its shape was visually represented, but it could not be picked up, and it did not exist isolated in space by itself. Man had to make further connections, adding these elements to the model in his mind. In the beginning, then, I believe that paintings represented nouns in language and that verbs were applied to them. A man could be depicted running, or an animal, for example, but running could not be shown virtually unless it was connected with something or someone who did the running. Here, further elaboration was necessary. The replica model could be moved through the air to suggest motion, while the drawing had to depict motion, running, walking, and so on its own. The models of objects could be arranged or rearranged to suggest various orders and sequences, one placed before the other like blocks. But the drawn picture of the object lost that mobility. hence the birth of sentences, as the drawings had to be drawn in a new way each time with a new meaning was intended. I believe that nouns and verbs arose in this way, as their need became apparent. These stand for the natural mobility apparent through natural sense data as man moves through his world. Again, I also believe that there is some kind of magic or attraction or sympathy between an object and its drawn or painted image that was understood by early man and forgotten.